In December 1980, Kano, one of Nigeria's most important northern cities, was thrown into chaos. What began as a religious movement around one controversial preacher became one of the deadliest urban uprisings in Nigeria's post-independence history. For days, parts of Kano turned into a battlefield. Thousands were killed, families were displaced, the police were overwhelmed, the military was called in, and by the time the violence ended, the leader of the movement, Muhammad Marwa, popularly known as Maitatsine, was dead. But the movement did not die with him. More violence followed in places like Bulumkutu, Kaduna, Yola and Gombe in the early 1980s. Scholars later described the Maitatsine risings between 1980 and 1985 as a revolt of the disinherited, shaped not only by religion, but also by poverty, alienation, migration, unemployment, and weak state response. So, who was Maitatsine? How did his movement grow? Why did it explode in 1980? And what lessons should Nigeria learn to prevent future deadly movements? This is the story of the Maitatsine movement. Maitatsine was not his real name. His real name was Muhammad Marwa. He was originally from the Marwa area in northern Cameroon and later settled in Kano, where he became known for his fierce and confrontational preaching. Several historical accounts describe him as a Cameroonian religious teacher whose followers later revolted in Kano in December 1980. The name Maitatsine comes from Hausa. It is commonly understood to mean the one who curses or the one who damns. That name reflected the style of his preaching. He was known for harsh condemnations, verbal attacks, and rejection of many aspects of modern life. He criticized radios, he criticized wristwatches, he criticized bicycles, cars, and other modern inventions. He attacked established religious authorities, he challenged the political order, and he attracted followers who saw him as a man speaking against corruption, inequality, and moral decline. But what began as preaching gradually hardened into a dangerous movement. To understand why people followed Maitatsine, we should not look only at the message. We must also look at the conditions around the people who listened. Many of his followers were poor, socially displaced, or frustrated by the system. Some were young migrants. Some were unemployed. Some were almajirai, or street-based Quranic students. Some felt rejected by mainstream society. Some distrusted the political and religious elite. Academic studies of the Maitatsine crisis repeatedly point to deeper social and economic conditions behind the violence. Elizabeth Isiche's study described the risings as connected to the social forces produced by economic problems in Nigeria at the time. This is important. Movements like this do not grow only because of one preacher. They grow when people feel abandoned. They grow when young people have no work. They grow when the state is absent. They grow when religious authority is unregulated. They grow when anger has nowhere constructive to go. Maitatsine gave his followers identity, belonging, and a sense of moral superiority. That combination can become dangerous when it is mixed with isolation, intolerance, and violence. Kano was not an ordinary city. It was a major commercial, religious, and cultural center in northern Nigeria. For centuries, Kano had been known for trade, Islamic scholarship, textile production, and urban life. But by the 1970s, the city was under pressure, population was increasing, rural migrants were arriving, urban poverty was rising, religious groups were competing for influence, and the relationship between traditional authority, modern politics, and religious activism was becoming more complicated. Maitatsine settled into this environment and built his following. Over time, his group became known as Tatsine, meaning the followers of Maitatsine. They were not just ordinary listeners. They became a tightly bonded community with a strong sense of separation from wider society. That separation is one of the warning signs of a dangerous movement. As Maitatsine's influence grew, so did confrontation. His teachings challenged mainstream Muslim scholars and traditional religious leaders. His followers became increasingly hostile toward those who disagreed with them. The movement's rejection of modern life and established religious interpretation created tension within Kano's Muslim community. The issue was not just disagreement. Society can survive disagreement. The danger came from intolerance, the belief that everyone outside the movement was corrupt, false, or an enemy. According to a 1985 study in the American Journal of Islam and Society, public explanations for the disturbances varied widely. Some people blamed religious fanaticism, some blamed politics, some blamed illegal aliens, and others blamed outside forces. The study argued that the unrest reflected deeper problems of underdevelopment, poor governance, and social frustration. That is why Maitatsine must be understood as both a religious and social crisis. As Maitatsine's influence grew, so did confrontation. His teachings challenged mainstream Muslim scholars and traditional religious leaders. His followers became increasingly hostile toward those who disagreed with them. The movement's rejection of modern life and established religious interpretation created tension within Kano's Muslim community. The issue was not just disagreement. Society can survive disagreement. The danger came from intolerance, the belief that everyone outside the movement was corrupt, false, or an enemy. According to a 1985 study in the American Journal of Islam and Society, public explanations for the disturbances varied widely. Some people blamed religious fanaticism, some blamed politics, some blamed illegal aliens, and others blamed outside forces. The study argued that the unrest reflected deeper problems of underdevelopment, poor governance, and social frustration. That is why Maitatsine must be understood as both a religious and social crisis. By the end of the Kano uprising, Maitatsine was dead. His death ended his personal command over the movement, but it did not end the ideology or the anger that sustained it. That is one of the biggest lessons from this history. Killing or arresting a leader may end a battle, but it does not automatically solve the conditions that created the movement. The followers scattered, some disappeared into other cities, some regrouped, some carried the ideology forward, and Nigeria would soon discover that the Maitatsine crisis was not over. After the 1980 Kano uprising, similar disturbances broke out in other parts of northern Nigeria. In 1982, violence occurred in Bulumkutu near Maiduguri and in Kaduna. In 1984, there was another major crisis in Yola. In 1985, violence followed in Gombe. This pattern showed that the movement was bigger than one city and one man. Academic records describe new risings in Rigasa and Bulumkutu in 1982, Yola in 1984, and Gombe in 1985. The Maitatsine movement had become a warning sign. Nigeria was dealing with a deeper problem: the rise of violent fringe movements among communities that felt excluded, angry, and disconnected from the state. The Maitatsine movement became dangerous because several factors came together. First, there was economic frustration. Many followers came from the margins of society. They were poor, unemployed, or socially displaced. Second, there was religious extremism. The movement created a rigid worldview where outsiders were treated as enemies. Third, there was social isolation. Followers lived mentally and sometimes physically apart from the wider community. Fourth, there was weak early response. By the time the state acted decisively, the movement had already grown into a security threat. Fifth, there was failure of trust. When people no longer trust government, religious leaders, traditional authorities, or the justice system, they become easier targets for dangerous movements. This is why the Maitatsine story should not be reduced to one man's preaching. It was a system failure. Behind every historical number is a human life. The Maitatsine crisis destroyed families. People lost parents, children, neighbors, businesses, homes, and places of worship. Markets were disrupted. Communities were traumatized. Security agencies suffered casualties. Religious relationships were damaged, and the fear remained long after the fighting ended. Kano carried the memory, northern Nigeria carried the warning, and Nigeria carried another question. How could such a movement grow for so long before the country fully understood the danger? The Maitatsine crisis had several major impacts. First, it changed Nigeria's understanding of internal security. Before this crisis, many people did not imagine that a religious movement could turn into such a deadly urban conflict. Second, it exposed the weakness of intelligence gathering. A movement had grown, armed itself socially and psychologically, and gathered followers before the state fully confronted its threat. Third, it deepened suspicion of migrants and outsiders. Because Maitatsine came from Cameroon and some followers were non-Nigerians, the crisis fed public anxiety about foreign nationals in Nigeria. But historians and official discussions also warned against reducing the crisis to foreigners alone, because many of the deeper causes were local: poverty, governance failure, and social alienation. Fourth, it affected religious relations. The crisis intensified concern about extremist preaching, sectarian rivalry, and the consequences of religious intolerance. Fifth, it became a historical reference point for later insurgencies. Many analysts have compared Maitatsine with later violent movements in Nigeria, including Boko Haram. The comparison should be made carefully because the groups are not identical, but the warning signs are similar: charismatic leadership, anti-state messaging, poor youth recruitment, social alienation, and delayed state response. Was Maitatsine simply a religious crisis? The answer is no. Religion was central to the movement's identity and message, but the crisis cannot be fully understood through religion alone. It was also about class. It was about young people who felt abandoned. It was about migration into cities. It was about unemployment. It was about weak governance. It was about a society where dangerous ideas found people who were already angry and vulnerable. The 1985 study in the American Journal of Islam and Society linked the disturbances to underdevelopment, governmental mismanagement, and social conditions that left people at odds with themselves. So, the Maitatsine crisis teaches us that extremism often grows where hardship and ideology meet. The Maitatsine movement showed warning signs before the violence. A leader who presented himself as the only source of truth. A movement that rejected peaceful disagreement. Followers who became isolated from mainstream society. hostility toward other religious voices, a growing base among poor and angry young people, a pattern of confrontation with authorities, and a state response that came too late. These signs are not limited to one religion, one region, or one period in history. Any society that ignores these warning signs is leaving space for future crises. The first lesson is simple. Poverty is not just an economic issue, it is also a security issue. When young people have no education, no jobs, no direction, and no hope, they become vulnerable to anyone who offers belonging and purpose. This does not mean poor people are violent. Most poor people are peaceful. But poverty creates conditions that dangerous leaders can exploit. A country that abandons its young people should not be surprised when destructive movements try to recruit them. So preventing another Maitatsine means investing in education, skills, jobs, housing and social protection. Security does not begin only with guns and checkpoints. It begins with opportunity. The second lesson is that religious preaching must be monitored responsibly without persecuting legitimate religious expression. This is a delicate balance. A democratic society must protect freedom of worship and freedom of speech. But society must also act when speech becomes direct incitement to violence, dehumanization, or organized hatred. The answer is not blanket repression. Repression can make dangerous movements go underground. The better answer is early engagement, community reporting, responsible regulation, credible religious scholarship, and strong legal action when clear lines are crossed. Dangerous preaching must be challenged before it becomes dangerous mobilization. The third lesson is that community leadership matters. Before a crisis becomes national news, somebody in the community usually knows something is wrong. A strange group is gathering. A preacher is becoming more extreme. Young people are disappearing into a closed circle. Weapons or violent language are entering daily conversation. People are being taught to hate their neighbors. Community leaders, traditional rulers, religious scholars, youth leaders, and women's groups are often the first to notice. But they must be empowered and trusted. When local leaders are ignored, politicized, or reduced to ceremony, early warning systems become weak. A modern security system must listen to the grassroots. The fourth lesson is that intelligence must come before force. By the time soldiers are deployed, the situation has usually already failed. A healthy security system detects danger early. It studies patterns. It understands local grievances. It monitors violent rhetoric. It builds trust with communities. It separates harmless dissent from genuine threats. It acts before violence becomes mass violence. Force may stop an immediate crisis, but intelligence prevents the next one. The Maitatsine crisis showed the cost of reacting too late. One of the most sensitive lessons is the question of Almajiri and out-of-school children. The Maitatsine movement found many vulnerable young people on the margins. Today, Nigeria still struggles with millions of out-of-school children, especially in the north. Any society that leaves children to survive on the streets is creating a recruitment pool for criminals, extremists, and violent movements. The solution is not to insult tradition. The solution is reform. Religious education and formal education must work together. Children need Quranic education, but they also need literacy, numeracy, food, healthcare, protection, digital skills, and future employment. No child should be left to choose between survival and manipulation. Dangerous ideas cannot be defeated only by arrest. they must also be defeated by better ideas. People need credible voices they can trust. Religious scholars must speak clearly against violent extremism. Teachers must help young people think critically. Media creators must produce content that explains history, exposes manipulation, and humanizes communities. Parents must have conversations with children, and young people must see a future larger than anger. A society that leaves the information space empty should not be surprised when extremists feel it. The final lesson is trust. When people trust government, they report danger early. When people trust the justice system, they do not seek violent alternatives. When people trust religious leaders, they are less likely to follow fringe voices. When people trust society, they are less vulnerable to movements that preach total rejection. But trust is not built by speeches. Trust is built by fairness, service delivery, justice, jobs, security, and accountability. Maitatsine grew in the cracks of society. To prevent future deadly movements, Nigeria must close those cracks. The Maitatsine movement is not just a story from 1980, it is a warning from history. It tells us that deadly movements do not appear from nowhere. They grow from neglected communities. They grow from poverty. They grow from intolerance. They grow from weak institutions. They grow when dangerous leaders turn frustration into hate. Muhammad Marwa, known as Maitatsine, died in 1980. But the conditions that produced his movement did not disappear overnight. That is why this history still matters. If Nigeria wants to prevent future deadly movements, it must go beyond emergency response. It must build schools before prisons are full. It must create jobs before anger is recruited. It must strengthen communities before extremists isolate them. It must regulate dangerous preaching without attacking genuine faith. It must listen early, act wisely, and govern fairly. Because the true lesson of Maitatsine is this: a country does not defeat extremism only when it wins the battle. It defeats extremism when it removes the conditions that make people willing to join one. If you found this story important, subscribe to Nigerian Encyclopedia for more documentaries on the people, events, and hidden histories that shaped Nigeria. In the next episode, we will examine another turning point in Nigeria's history and what it still teaches us today.